Welcome back. Good to see you again. So we've completed our discussion of the Bhagavad Gita, and we're now going to move on to a very different text. But we're still asking the question, what is the meaning of life? What is it to lead a meaningful life? I don't have to tell you that the ancient world is not a monolithic thing. There are a lot of ancient cultures, and there are many voices, and these voices come from very diverse cultures. So far, we've been focusing on voices from classical India. But we're now going to move from India back to the West, getting a bit closer to home. In India, we saw that the account of a meaningful life really wove together the transcendent and the immanent into a single whole. In the West, we've got two very different roots that come together as foundations for our culture. The first of those is the Greek, and the second is the Semitic. From classical Greece, we inherit a philosophical vision that we derive from people like Plato and Aristotle and so forth. From the Semitic, we get our biblical heritage that grounds the religious traditions of the Judaic, the Christian, and the Muslim tradition. We might say that in this tradition, the Greeks focus on the mundane dimension of an account of the meaning of life, and the Hebrew Bible and the Semitic tradition it represents gives us the transcendent. So often when I think about how Western philosophy, subsequent to the classical period, begins to think about moral psychology and human life, I think of it as a union of this focus on the mundane character of human life out of Greece and this transcendent vision of the universe that comes out of the Middle East. Now, there's another kind of transition that we'll be making today that I want to talk about just a bit. In the Gita, we saw a very poetic text, a text that expressed itself in a kind of epic poetry, very rich in metaphor, very beautiful text. And our task as readers was to take these beautiful poetic verses and see them as more than just beautiful poetry, to read the metaphors and to provide the philosophical analysis and argument that lay beneath them. But the text that we're going to be reading today is a very different kind of text. It's a somewhat drier text in some ways. It's prose. More than that, though, it's not even a text written by Aristotle, even though we call it an Aristotelian text. The title of the text is the Nicomachean Ethics. And what that means is it's the text on ethics that was edited and composed by Nicomachus. Hence the term Nicomachean Ethics. It's Nicomachus's ethics. Who was Nicomachus? Nicomachus was Aristotle's son and student. I actually think it's a really bad idea to teach your own kids, but Aristotle was a heavy dude. He's allowed to do what he wants to do. But anyway, so what Nicomachus was doing was sitting in Aristotle's lectures in the academy on ethics and taking notes. And what we have in the Nicomachean Ethics is Nicomachus's lecture notes on Aristotle's ethics. It terrifies me to think of what would happen if one of my students' lecture notes were published centuries from now over my name. I know that it wouldn't be exactly what I said. I know that I'd be misquoted, and I know that I'd be really embarrassed by some of the things they chose to actually write down. But that's Aristotle's fate. So we'll be reading a text that will be a bit dry because we're actually reading lecture notes on ethics written by Nicomachus. So our textual task will be slightly different. The kind of reading that we'll be doing will be slightly different. But on the other hand, the good news is that while in the Gita, so many of the arguments and analysis were kind of left in the background and merely suggested, we're going to see that the beauty of Aristotle's text is that the argument is right there on the page, crystal clear and sharp, and there for us to read. That's the benefit. So today, what I want to do is to begin by talking a bit about the context of this text and of Aristotle's life. Talk a little bit about the Platonic background against which Aristotle works, including Aristotle's relationship to his teacher Plato, and then spend most of my time on the architecture of Aristotle's view, only dipping into the text at the very end and focusing on the text in detail in the next two lectures. So, let's begin with a bit of context. Aristotle himself, of course, lived in Greece. He lived from approximately 384 before the Common Era to 322 before the Common Era. And he was clearly an aristocrat, a citizen of Athens, and a member of a reasonably noble family. He studied with Plato at Plato's Academy and was, of course, Plato's star student. And after graduating from the Academy, he became the tutor to Alexander the Great, who, of course, conquered the world. That's a pretty good lineage, Plato, Aristotle, conquer the world. Besides being Alexander's tutor, he taught at his own academy called the Lyceum in Athens for many years. Late in his life, he had to flee Athens because he was charged with impiety. Now, of course, you know that Aristotle was not the first Greek philosopher to be charged with impiety. That's the charge on which Socrates was tried and executed. So Aristotle, not wanting, as he put it, the citizens of Athens to commit a second sin against philosophy, fled Athens and died at the age of 62 in Chalcis. Plato, of course, is most famous for writing in a dialogue form. Aristotle also wrote dialogues, and he wrote quite a bit, apparently. Unfortunately, none of Aristotle's own texts survive. Even though we have a large Aristotelian corpus, all of that corpus is in the form of lecture notes. But at least his students took good notes. So this is a bit of the context. Aristotle's teacher, as I said, was Plato. And Aristotle also establishes a wonderful precedent in the history of Western philosophy. Because very often we think that students inherit their teachers' views and propagate them. Aristotle showed that that needn't be so, and that the best philosophy emerges when a teacher actively is criticized by his students. And so we find that whereas Plato emphasized the abstract and the ideal, argued that the material world is not nearly as real as a perfect world of forms or concepts, whereas Plato argued that we have innate knowledge and that sensory knowledge is all kind of confused, Aristotle focused on the importance of sensory knowledge, argued that all of our knowledge is acquired, argued that the theory of forms doesn't make any sense, and provided a completely opposite philosophical view from that of Plato. And so one of the really lovely things about Aristotle's place in our Western tradition is he really inaugurates this tradition of active critique of one's own teachers and generates this ideal that we have in the liberal arts tradition of academic debate rather than simply parroting what one has been taught. So for that reason, I really adore Aristotle's work and Aristotle's life. So now what I want to do is to turn a bit to the architecture of Aristotelian philosophy, and within that architecture, we'll talk about the architecture of his ethics. We're going to begin with a discussion of Aristotle's view of the soul. And before we do that, I think we need to talk a little bit about the term, because even though the Greek term anima is translated as soul, the word soul has acquired in English enough theological and metaphysical baggage that I think that it's actually come to be a kind of bad translation of the Greek term anima, which is what Aristotle is talking about. Now, you don't have to be a brilliant philologist to see that the word anima is related to the word animal, to the idea of being animated. The anima is that which animates something, something which gives it life. It's not some immortal thing that's the basis of action and good and evil. It's not something that travels between lives or that survives the death of the body or anything like that as far as Aristotle is concerned. When Aristotle uses the word anima, he simply means the kind of principle or set of processes that makes us different from rocks, what it is that gives life to something. So we might better translate anima as life principle. On the other hand, the word soul has become so entrenched in Aristotelian translation that it would be weird to use a different term. So I'm going to use that word soul, but wherever I use it, you're going to be conscious of the fact that it's translating the term anima, this notion of that which animates something. Now, Aristotle wasn't just a philosopher. He was also a mathematician, a logician, and a biologist. And in fact, he undertook biological expeditions where he collected samples of animals and plants from various places in Greece and wrote about biology. And Aristotle's view of the soul, of the anima, is a very biological view. He's worried about what animates things, and he thinks of those in scientific terms. It reflects the fact that Aristotle thinks of human beings primarily as natural objects, as one sophisticated kind of animal, not as spiritual beings whose minds are in direct communion with abstract forms, as his teacher Plato thought of us. And so Aristotle argued that the anima, or the soul, this principle, has a number of different layers that we can think of as from the most primitive to the most sophisticated or recent. And you can actually see a lot of the roots of modern biological thinking in Aristotle's account. I mean, not literally modern, but you can see the roots. So Aristotle argues that the simplest, the bottom level of the soul is what he calls the vegetative part of the soul. That's the part that's involved just in growth and nutrition and the absorption of energy from the environment. And Aristotle argues that plants and animals all share this vegetative soul. It's a principle of life. Again, don't think of it as a mind of some kind. Think of it simply as what makes us work. So the fundamental level is this vegetative level that simply enables us to be living processes. Above that, Aristotle argues, is an appetitive soul, an appetitive anima. That is the one that gives us appetites for food, for water, sexual appetites, and in general, desires. And of course, that Aristotle thought was a level of soul, a level of anima, that is distinctive to animals, but which plants don't share, this kind of appetitive soul. But some animals have an appetitive soul, Aristotle thought, but not a sensory anima, a sensory soul. Very primitive animals, maybe mollusks or things. And the next level of soul that Aristotle recognized was a sensory soul, the aspect of our life that makes it possible for us to see, hear, smell, and so forth. That's a higher level of organization, if you want. And above that, Aristotle argued, was the locomotive soul, the part that's responsible for motor control, that allows us to move around. That's something that we share with most animals, but Aristotle pointed out, not all animals, some can't move, but most can. And finally, and unique to human beings, Aristotle argued was the rational soul, the rational anima. And that's the part of the soul, the part of our principle that enables us to act, that allows us to think, that allows us to use language, that allows us to reason, that allows us to understand. And Aristotle argued that that is unique to human beings. Now, whenever we think about Aristotle's moral philosophy and Aristotle's account of what a good life is, which is where we're going to be spending the next few lectures, we want to think of it in the context of this understanding of what it is to be a human being. Now, within that broad architecture, I want now to give you an overview, but just an overview, of Aristotle's vision of what human moral life is. And then we'll be working out the details of that account over the next two lectures. So this will be a kind of broad brush painting, and we'll fill in the details over the next few lectures. The central value for Aristotle, the central value is, I'm now going to use the Greek term, and then I'm going to talk about it for a minute, eudaimoneia. The term eudaimoneia is most often translated into English as happiness. That's a bad translation for some reasons. The reason that I don't like it is because in English, we often understand happiness to denote a kind of emotion, something transitory, a way of feeling. So we might ask, are you feeling happy today? No, today I'm sad, but yesterday I was happy. I was happy 10 minutes ago, now I'm a little down, but I know that in 15 minutes I'll be happy again. All of that makes sense in English, even if it bespeaks a kind of up and down roller coaster emotional life. Hey, some of us have lives like that. You couldn't say that in Greek about eudaimoneia. What eudaimonia means is to live well. Eu, good, daimonia, life, or soul, or spirit. To have a good spirit, to live well. So it's a very global kind of characterization. The word that I like to translate this, and is often used by Aristotelian scholars, is flourishing. To flourish, to lead a kind of overall, globally successful life, the kind of life one could recommend and endorse and be proud of at the end of days. That's the central value for Aristotle. And so, eudaimonia is a property not of a moment, and it's not an experience, but rather an evaluative property of a life as a whole. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics is asking the question, what is it to flourish as a human being? What is it to lead a really good life? What is eudaimonia? And as we're going to see, the bulk of the Nicomachean Ethics is devoted to that question. But we're going to come up on that question slowly, because Aristotle doesn't take for granted that the idea of eudaimonia is the central ethical notion, the central notion in a meaningful life. Whereas we're going to see, beginning late in this lecture and continuing through next lecture, Aristotle takes it as necessary to argue for that view, taking seriously opposing accounts of what a good life is. But we'll get there. Now, another really important aspect of Aristotelian ethics and of Aristotle's view about what a human being is Aristotle's idea that goodness is closely tied to function, and that we understand something when we understand its function. And here you'll see a tiny, faint echo of ideas in the Gita, where we talked about svadharma, performing one's function in a larger whole. Aristotle's not thinking of the Gita, of course, but it's worth making that connection sometimes. But Aristotle is going to argue that to be a good thing of a particular kind is always to perform the function that things of that kind perform well. Let's see what that means. Suppose we were asking, what is it to be a good knife? Well, we first ask what the function of a knife is. The function of a knife is to cut. So a good knife is a knife that cuts well, that performs its function well. That's why sharpness is good in knives. Not because it's pretty, not because it's hard to achieve, but because it has to do with the function of knives. What is it to be a good collie? To be a good collie is to herd sheep well. And so a good collie is one who does that well. Why? Because the function of a collie is to herd sheep. A good cook cooks well, a good carpenter builds well, a good doctor cures well, and so forth. And so Aristotle's idea is that for any artifact and for any human being, we can ask, what's the function of that thing? What's the function of that person? What's the function of that animal? And then we can ask what it is to be a good thing of that kind and answer that question always by appeal to that function. And that's why, beginning in a few minutes and really carrying over into the next lecture, we're going to be talking about what the function of a human being is. Because a central idea for Aristotle is that not only do kinds of human beings have functions, but human beings too ought to be for something. And if we ask what we're for, then we can ask what it is to perform that function well, and so what it is to be a good person, and so what the good for a human being is. So, let's talk in a bit more detail now about the structure of Aristotle's account of eudaimonia, of happiness or flourishing, so that we have some context for what's going to come. As I said, Aristotle will argue, and we'll begin that argument soon, that eudaimonia, that flourishing, is the highest good. The interesting thing about Aristotle's account is the complexity and multidimensionality of that account. So I want to give you a sense of how complex it's going to be, and then you'll have a framework within which to put all the various pieces that we're going to encounter. The first is, well, Aristotle argues that flourishing involves three orthogonal traits, or we can evaluate people on three orthogonal dimensions. The first of those is the dimension of virtue, or excellence. The Greek here is arete, And what it means is the character that makes a thing good of its kind. The virtue of a knife is sharpness. The virtue of a doctor is skill in curing. But we'll be talking about specifically human virtues. And the virtues are going to turn out to be the enduring states of character that enable us to flourish. Those will be the states of character that we hope to cultivate in order to lead a really good life. That's the first dimension. The second dimension, though, is what Aristotle calls practical wisdom. The Greek is phronesis. And practical wisdom we might refer to in, well, not English, but French that's made its way into English as savoir-faire, the knowledge of how to do things. In particular, practical wisdom for Aristotle, as we're going to see, is skill in deliberating and making choices and figuring out the way to attain one's goals. It's our virtues, as we'll see, that give us the goals that make our lives worthwhile, but it's not good enough to have good intentions, good goals, good wishes, good desires, and a wonderful character. If you can't bring all of that into productive action, Aristotle argues, you can't really flourish. And so virtue requires practical wisdom for its manifestation, a knowledge of actually how to bring about one's ends. But it's possible